right, everybody, it's Anthony Brogdon. Oh man, I'm so excited. I got this lady on the channel today. I've been watching her for years because she's in Detroit, just where I'm based. And it's amazing. Let me say this, everybody. You see people, and sometimes you don't know what they do. And I see her, and I didn't know what she did. But she has a, sense of eloquence and professionalism and so on and so forth. So I knew that resonated. But then now that I have been privy to the inside scoop, my friends, I am extremely impressed with this system. If I didn't say I'm Anthony Brogdon and I'm an ordinary guy doing something extraordinary as a result of strong inspirations, but even more so, the people who come on this show, like this lady right here, you're going to be highly impressed with this conversation, my friends. So hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspiration. It's free. I don't ask no money. I do this because it makes me a better person. How about that? And I know that there are people out there watching who are also better as a result of what they have learned and heard of on this show. So do that. Hit the like button on it. Send me comments. All right, and on the per the videos. Hit the notifications bell so you get a ding, a shock, a smoke signal, something to let you know there is new content. And there's new content every week. The one thing that also has happened is I've gone live now. Every Monday at 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I do a live show. And I pick a topic. And then I ask people, such as the viewers and others, to come on and let's talk about it. This coming, one of the topics that we'll have is why learn Black history is February enough. Why learn Black history is February enough. Just to give you an example, another one is how to teach Black history in them states that don't want you to teach it. Watch that one as it comes out, and they all will be posted here on Strong Inspirations. And there's other videos. Did you see the one I did with the guy who found out his great-grandfather was an enslaver in Barbados? He wrote a book about it. Watch that video. Did you see the one I did with Frederick Douglass's great-great-grandson? Watch that video. Did you see the one I did with the guy who says he discovered the technique to grow plants with rocks, not soil, but with rocks, because rocks are minerals? Watch that video. And it's amazing stuff that we're doing here. So watch them. Just go to videos and go down the list and pick them out for yourself and watch them. You can move the cursor as you see fit. All right, because it's YouTube. I'm a filmmaker, everybody. This is my documentary, businessintheblack.net. The Rise of Black Business in America. It's streaming on Amazon. This is the book that I've written titled Black Business Book, similar to the documentary, but many, many more facts. This is mind-blowing information in this book, and I add no commentary. And it got some pictures if you need some pictures, and it has quotes. So go and get you a copy of Black Business Book. It is on Amazon and on my website. I got this book here too for your kids. It's titled They Did It. It's 30 rich Black people in here that lived in the 1800s. So you see, I'm not playing with y'all. I'm giving you this information one way or another. And so get you a copy of that. Now, the children's book is only on the website at present. And to learn all what I'm doing, and I'm speaking in different places throughout America. I'm sharing this with folk. And so all that, my speaking engagements, where you can order the book, so on and so forth, is on my website, businessintheblack.net. All right? Now you hear me use this term strong a lot. Strong is my favorite word. I keep saying it because I love it. I doubt if I ever get tired of the word strong. Strong has a ton of connotation in my world. And some of it is strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is the lead in to my guest today. She's a strong sister, fashionable to everybody. Come on, introduce yourself. Thank you for being on Strong Inspirations.
Well, Anthony, first of all, I just wanted to say it's a privilege to be on here with a fellow Detroiter.
Yeah,
I've had the privilege of knowing Anthony now for several decades. Let's just say neither one of us had gray hair
that's
back,
right.
neither one of us had gray hair when we first met. But I just wanted to say and to honor the work that you have been doing. Anthony is a griot, and the contribution that he has made through his work is invaluable. Invaluable. This is an incredible archive that he has created. And I just want to say that one of the keys to liberation is archive that is made when you see yourself in an archive, but it is made by, when you see it is made by your community, for your community, and you see yourself in it. And
Excellent.
there's nothing like it. That is at the that is at the core of decolonization. It is at the core of liberation. And what Anthony has done is truly a gift. So I just wanted to
Thank you.
say thank you for
Thank
allowing
you.
me to be here today.
Okay, I got to ask you this. You got to tell us your name.
Oh, well, yes, my name is Alicia Diaz. I am a native Detroiter. My family, multi-generational Detroiters, and I am an instructor at the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies at Wayne State University, which actually is one of the oldest undergraduate academic centers dedicated to the study of the Latin American experience in and outside of the United States. In the United States, these academic centers were created with the rise of the civil rights movement here in the United States. And what you see coming, rising along with the Black liberation and Black power and Black and civil rights movement of the 1960s, you also see this happening within the Chicano community on the West Coast. You see it within the Puerto Rican community on the East Coast. And one of the outcomes of these power struggles is the beginning of seeing academic centers dedicated to the African American experience, the Chicano experience, and the Puerto Rican experience.
Okay,
And so this
let me
begins
stop
in the
you
late
there. I don't mean no
1960s.
disrespect. I mean no, you
Yeah,
rolling, everybody. You can tell she rolling. But I got to ask a
yeah,
couple questions of you personally. Let the audience get to know you. You alluded to that you were born and raised in Detroit. Is that correct?
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Did
And
you grow up
my
in a
family's
black
roots
neighborhood?
go back deep. Oh, excuse me. I am a Southwest Detroit child that grew up. I had grandparents in Southwest Detroit on my father's side. My father's side of my family is from Puerto Rico. They migrated. Notice I did not say immigrated. All Puerto Ricans are United States citizens. When they left the island, they moved like any other citizen moved in any other part that was controlled by the United States. They migrated in the late 1940s to Detroit, which was part of the another great migration. Many of us know of the great migration of African Americans, but there were others. And one of the others was that of Puerto Ricans migrating off the island after World War II in massive numbers to the mainland of the United States. My father's family was part of that. On my mother's side of the family, they were part of the Great Migration that probably most of your audience is familiar with, that of African Americans leaving the American South and coming north. And my mother's family began that migration in the late 1920s, arriving here in Detroit.
All right. Did where you grew up, did you know any white people? Did you grow up around white kids? Was it all of your same culture, or what was the
No,
dynamic?
I came of age in the late night beginning, with grade school in the late 1960s, and up until I started college in the early 1980s. And growing up predominantly in Southwest Detroit, I grew up in at the time, which was one of the most racially and ethnically diverse communities within the city of Detroit. So if you look at who I went to high school with and who I went to school with, I went to school with folks, everything from, for example, they were African American. They might have been Hungarian, whose grandparents still spoke Hungarian at home and still lived in the community of Del Rey. They could have been Polish. They were Christian Palestinians. They were Puerto Rican. They were Cuban. They were Native American. And so in that part of the city, I grew up, as I say, with an incredible amount
Okay.
of diversity. Yeah.
Okay. Well, what is your you said your parents, but what is your background? What do you call it? Are you Puerto Rican or yeah? This
Absolutely.
is there a term to it?
Absolutely.
May I say? Yes.
Yes, there is. First of all, I personally identify as an Afro Latinx woman who is also, and within that Latinx, that expression of my Latin American heritage is through Puerto Rico. And the name that many Puerto Ricans use for themselves is Boricua. Boricua. And that term comes from the indigenous original name of the island of Puerto Rico that was given to it, known as Borinquen by the Taino people, meaning land of the great Lord. And that was the name of that space before the arrival in 1492 of the man known commonly as Christopher Columbus, who arrived. He was lost. He was trying to get to Japan, actually, and actually ends up in what is now Bermuda. And so I identify as, first and foremost, in my Blackness, in my Latinidad, and in my pride as being a woman.
Okay. Let's stay on that just a tad then. With uh so are you a mixed heritage? So your mom is black and your dad is Puerto Rican. Is that am
That
I
is
right
correct.
on that?
Yes, you are. But let's be careful about these labels because, first of all, within the core of the Latin American experience is Blackness. So, when I was listening to you, Anthony, and when you talk about when we talk about Black history, let us understand and remember a few things. Number one, of the approximately 10 million people who were taken from the African continent, who
Right,
survived the Middle Passage,
right.
who survived, if you take them statistically, more than 9 out of 10 of them never set foot in what became the United States.
That's right.
They all landed south of what is now the US. And so it is predominantly the land that was under the colonial control of the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire that became the repository for what became a literal transplantation, a tsunami from the African continent of this incredible diversity of consciousness and of identity. And so when you look at, for example, Brazil, which has the single largest concentration of people of African descent outside of the continent, what you are looking at was the Congo was transplanted. What is now Angola and the Congo was literally transplanted to Brazil. And you see multiple complex expressions of Blackness throughout the Latin Americas. The first person identified to be from the African continent that set foot in what is now the Americas landed in the Caribbean, landed in what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And that person was a free person. The
Okay,
first woman of African descent, a free woman, landed in the same space of what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti.
okay,
And so to tell the story of Blackness in the Americas, the story begins in the Caribbean. This is where it begins. And then you see where within, when we talk about 1619 here in what is now the United States, which is the date of the first acknowledgement of human beings being brought for the
I
purposes
got you.
of
Right.
sale here. By that point, the transatlantic slave trade had been in place for more than for a century in
Yeah,
Latin
let
America.
me ask you this. So, as a Puerto Rican, do they say black or I mean, do they use that term? Or do they
The
say
short
Puerto
answer,
Rican, which separates them from being black? How does that work?
you know, well, and I'm glad you bring up that question because what I would like to do is let's step back for a minute and is to remember, when we think of Blackness, we are thinking about a global diaspora. And when we think about the expressions and the complexity of Black identity across the planet, it's everything from folks in Suriname speaking a Dutch-based patois, to Puerto Ricans, to someone who is from, like, on my mother's side of the family. My grandmother was from Delo, Mississippi, an area, by the way, that has a deep concentration of Congo DNA within that part of the United States. It is how this expression of Blackness plays out depending on where you are from. So in the case of Puerto Ricans, what you have is that Puerto Ricans, like across Latin America, represent a complex ethnic mixture that people often talk about it, being indigenous, for their indigenous, European, and African. However, and this is what something is to make clear, that many times during this discussion, and this is what has changed now very much in the 20th and the 21st century, is that the identities of these mixed race identities often did so at the expense of placing Blackness and indigeneity front and center. That there was often more of a shift and a perspective more toward Europe than from these other identities. And so what you see in Puerto Rico, which by the way has a deep legacy of Blackness within it, the heart of Blackness within Puerto Rico, by the way, is the region known as Loíza. But what you have is that particularly in the 20th century, is that you see the rise particularly of a Black consciousness. And by the 1960s, with especially young Puerto Ricans in New York City, the act of revolution that they begin to wage is saying, we want to free Puerto Rico. Oh, and by the way, we're Black. And so the Blackness becomes a symbol, a revolutionary symbol with Puerto Ricans. And it becomes one of saying we are placing our Black identity front and center when we talk about who we are. Yeah. And
Now,
so it is, yeah, absolutely. And
so
by the way, Puerto
when we
Ricans come
talk
in all
about
shades.
when we talk about Black and brown, what is brown? Is brown people from Latin America? Is that or what? When they say that, what are they talking about?
And I'm glad, we're talking about these terms before we get started.
Yeah.
The first of all, we have to remember is that these notions of these racial identifications, are based on a lie. We are all one race. We're human.
Right.
That's number one. We are all human, and we know that humanity originated on what we call now the African continent. Right. This is where it all came from.
That's right.
It's from the dispersal of human beings from the African continent.
Right.
Now, having gone from that, these ideas of what is Black and what is brown and who is identified as such comes out from the Latin American experience, is coming out of a racial, comes out of a racial construct. Now, there is no doubt about it. Within the Spanish and the Portuguese, practice of colonization, they practice racial supremacy. There's number one, there's no question about that. Number two, though, unlike the United States, they were presented with a different issue. Unlike the United States, where there came a point in United States history where the colonization of the US made it what people would call, quote, a majority white country, that was not the case in Latin America. Latin America has never been majority European because it was outnumbered by indigenous people. Right. It was outnumbered by African peoples. And later on, then you got the introduction of people from Asia, from the whole world shows up.
Right.
And so these terms about, well, who is Black and who is brown? Well, hold on. It's like, wait a minute. Hold on just a second. When you talk about, quote, brown people, usually people think about Latin Americans who come in all shades.
Okay.
All shades, all possible combinations.
Okay.
And when you talk about this, this brown consciousness, it really, you have to talk about this coming from what part, who are you speaking of? And it's really something, this comes out of the United States.
Right.
It really does. And it comes out of the US with regard to what do you do? And see, and this was a problem for the United States, especially with our census and everything else. This is a country that practiced the one drop rule with regard to identity and the maintaining of racialized power in the United States. But what do you do with people who don't fit, who now they quote, are not white, even though many of them, they certainly are. They are not, quote, Black, even though millions but hold on, millions are. So what happens here in the United States is the rise of this, quote, brown identity that
Okay.
frankly comes a lot of it out of Mexican identity here in the United States.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Is there a racial class in Puerto Rico? Is there like a light complected, dark complected Puerto Ricans? Because I don't know that. Yeah, well, how does that work?
First of all, I just want to remind everyone that's listening, it is absolutely impossible to have practiced colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the subjugation of indigenous people, and not have racism and colorism.
Right,
It's hand in glove.
right.
Now,
Okay,
how it plays out depends on where you were at. And so what happens is that, and I follow Ibram Kendi, brother Ibram Kendi, the author of the book, who says how to be an anti-racist, but he reminds us that racism and colorism are a cancer. They are a sickness. And it metastasizes. And metastasis, when something metastasizes, it spreads but it morphs. So when you see a cancer is different in one part of the body than it may be in another, how it expresses itself, but it'll still kill you,
right.
depend if unchecked. Well, it's the same thing with racism and colorism. You have it throughout the Americas. There's no place that escaped it. How it plays out depends on where you were from. So
Right.
in Puerto Rico as a whole, number one, does Puerto Rico suffer from racism? Yes. Does it suffer from colorism? Yes. Does its expression of racism and colorism, is it specific to the island? Yes. And if you go throughout the Americas, whether it's Haiti, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Argentina, it does not matter. Everyone has their own unfortunate version of how this plays out
Okay.
within their identity.
Let me ask you this. How was a person, a light-skinned Puerto Rican, compared to a person that's a dark skinned? And let me just give you an idea of what I'm talking about. A light-skinned Puerto Rican, one of their ancestors had relations with enslaver. Uh,
Possibly, or
I, I,
possibly free, or they could have been free. I
oh,
mean,
free. Yeah, but
my
that's how it works
yeah, I mean, it's the same as the story is here in the
in
United
the United
States.
States.
Now,
Okay.
now here's the difference. The difference is if you go do, for example, a DNA test, what you find there is a couple of differences, like if you compare to African Americans here in the US. And here's the big difference. With regard to European ancestry, in the United States, disproportionately African Americans' European ancestry comes from the British Isles, places like Great Britain, Scotland, Ireland, for example. Disproportionate representation is from there. This has to do with the colonization of the United States
Right.
and the original 13 colonies.
Right.
Now, if you look at if you look at an island like Puerto Rico, if you look at the DNA profile of European ancestry, well, now it's disproportionately coming from Spain. It's coming from Portugal. It could be coming from Scandinavia because
Oh,
Scandinavians were in the
really? I
Caribbean.
see what you're saying.
So what it is, it's a different European mix with regard to DNA.
I got you.
Also, the indigenous DNA is different in the Caribbean. And what you have is, for example, with Puerto Ricans, they actually have the single largest concentration of Taino, was one of the indigenous people of the Caribbean, that is found significantly in the Puerto Rican population. And then finally, and it's not finally because of numbers,
Right.
when you look at African ancestry, the genetic mix can often be different than what you see in the US. And it has to do with, frankly, the patterns of the transatlantic slave trade, who was brought from which region,
I got
when,
you.
and to where.
I got you.
And so and
I
so
got you.
that's the differences that you
I
see.
got you. I want to stay on this just a tad more because you jamming, and we're gonna get into the
So
other part of the story. I promise you. But
no problem.
where is it? Was there slavery in Puerto Rico? And
There were
then how
first,
did slavery end in Puerto Rico? Just give us a little bit of that history.
sure. Number one, there was no place. I want to make this clear. There was no place in the Spanish Empire or the Portuguese Empire where slavery was not practiced.
I got you.
That slavery, though, was not restricted to African peoples. Overwhelmingly, overwhelmingly it was it was the enslavement of human beings from the African continent.
Right.
However, it also represented the enslavement of millions of indigenous people. It also, toward the latter part in the 19th century, would go on to include people, for example, from, well, actually earlier than that, but my thing is it would go on to include people from China as well, depending on where you were. For example, this happened in Cuba and in Peru. But within Puerto Rico, so what you see is slavery began in the Caribbean. Slavery actually begins first with indigenous people. That's where it begins. Actually, the first ever trip of the transatlantic slave trade, where someone is transporting human beings on the Atlantic for the purposes of slavery, the first shipment was indigenous Taino people that Columbus captured, put from his first voyage, put on his ships, one of his surviving ships, and brought them back to Spain as proof of what he had found. I didn't say who, what. After that, shortly thereafter that, the beginnings of then what we think of as the transatlantic slave trade, the beginning of
Okay.
millions of people from the African continent. And so Puerto Rico was one of the early places that experienced both indigenous slavery and African slavery,
I
both.
got you. Okay, how did slavery end in Puerto Rico, and
Um,
when, and was there revolts and things of that sort?
look, I'll just start with this. There was no place in the Americas that there was not revolt.
Right. Oh, sure.
Revolt,
No question. No
yeah,
question.
and that revolt was done by African peoples, it was done by indigenous people, and in Cuba, you had resistance that was done by the Chinese too, who had run away to the hills for freedom, along
Okay.
with African Cubans also trying to become to liberate themselves as well.
Okay.
But in Puerto Rico, what you had was that, and it's a separate history from it was a separate history from the United States, is that there was a systematic, depending on what country you were in, systematic abolition of slavery. And it begins, depending on where you were in Latin America, is how early it begins. One of the first places to eliminate it actually was Mexico. Why? Mexico had a revolution, fought for its independence at the beginning of the 19th century, and part of that was the abolition of slavery.
Okay.
And so, but one of the last places to end slavery was Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. They're at the
Really?
tail end.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so what you see in Puerto Rico is this gradual, begins in like the late 1860s. This is shortly after the Civil War here in the United States, in which you have this quote gradual abolition until it is done by the early 1870s. In Cuba, it would not be officially done until the early 1880s, the same as with Brazil.
Really? Okay. Okay. So,
So it
uh,
depends where you were.
yeah, I got you. So now how did you get to love Black history like you do? And this is the lead into what we also want to talk about.
I was very fortunate to have as a grandmother on my mother's side. Her name, and I will uplift her name as my ancestor. Her name was Alice Grubbs Thomas. Is that she was a griot. My grandmother was a walking, living oral historian who I grew up hearing the stories of her life in great detail. Place names, people's names, relationships. This was something, she was an amazing, amazing storyteller. And as a child, I frankly was mesmerized by it. And I also grew up in a family of readers. Every year for the holidays, if growing up, you would get new clothes and toys, but you always got a book. You always had a book.
Okay.
And I grew up in a home that valued education, but valued more importantly, it's not just education, because you can be educated, not have wisdom. And it
Right.
depends on what you're being taught.
Right. That's
Um,
right.
is that our home valued free thinking, critical thinking. And this was particularly something for my grandmother, who was from a small town called Delo, Mississippi, about 30 miles from Jackson. And she had always had a frustrated dream that she had never completed her education.
Okay.
Um, there was no black high school in her small town. She was born in 1908, of course, in the grips of Jim Crow.
Yeah,
um
sure.
her community her community had no high school. She was able to make it to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which did have an African American high school, but she was only able to stay there for 2 years. There wasn't just not enough money for her to do it, so she was able to go to the 10th grade. But after that, she was a self-taught, self-educated woman who was a voracious reader. She instilled, that was instilled in my mother, and they instilled it in myself and my sister.
I got you. So this led you to do what you do, and now let's talk about the project.
Yeah,
I'm gonna let you go. You can tell us what it is, and so on
and
and
talk
so
about it.
forth.
Well, Anthony's asked me to come and speak to you today about, what people hear about now, the Day of the Dead, and the practice of ofrenda, and what is happening in the United States with regard to this. And, as an instructor in Latin American studies, I teach my classes very much from a perspective that places African diasporic identity and indigenous identity at the core of the Latin American experience, not as a footnote, not as an aside. And so one of the things that goes to from, and I want to make it clear, when we talk about this celebration now, that is, very much more on the consciousness here in the United States of celebrating the Day of the Dead, is that where does this come from? How does it play into Latin American identity? And how now it is something that is being practiced by folks, regardless of how you identify yourself. So let me start first with this, is that first of all, the Day of the Dead, which is officially celebrated at the end of October, the beginning of November, those dates tie into both European and indigenous history. But this legacy comes out of what is now modern day Mexico and Guatemala. And it is a practice that goes back for millennia amongst indigenous people with regard to how their relationship between the living and the dead and how they communicated together.
Okay.
And Anthony, if you'll allow me, I have a
Yeah,
few slides
yeah,
to
please.
show to shows our audience. And so what I'm going to do, okay,
All right.
first what I wanted to show everybody is that when we talk about the Day of the Dead in the United States and this celebration, it has nothing to do with Halloween. Nothing. Zero. Halloween is a tradition that has deep roots in pre-Christian Europe, and it is a celebration that, in which it was also deeply rooted in the relationship between pre-Christian traditions in Europe, their expression of their indigenous faiths, and how they related to their relationship between their ancestors, the dead, and the living. And on their calendars and their cycles, they had designated times of the year, oftentimes, changed to changes of seasons, in which this was celebrated, in which there were times of the year in which they felt that the veil between the living and the dead became thinner, and that the two sides could meet up. So Halloween has its own separate legacy. The Day of the Dead arises totally independently, what we think of it as now, again, in what is now most Mexico and Guatemala, and is strictly comes from, its origins are indigenous, from the indigenous people of that region. However, the traditions in the United States that we think of as the Day of the Dead really reflect mostly Mexican influence as opposed to Guatemalan. And so what I'm going to be talking about here is more skewed toward the Mexican side of it, because that's what has become predominant here in the United States.
All right.
And so to do that, first I'm just going to show and talk about some of the imagery that people see. Why do you have these skeletons and other things, for example, for the Day of the Dead? And one of the things I'm going to show you is this figure that you see here of what is known as a Zolo. And I'm going to probably massacre, I apologize, the Nahuatl, the indigenous pronunciation of this, but the short word is Zolo, but it's a Zolo Litzcuintli, which in the tradition of the people that people call Aztecs, by the way, they didn't call themselves that. They referred to themselves as Mexica. That's why Mexico is called Mexico. The
Right.
Mexica people is that this was their symbol of a guide to the dead, because they looked at their underworld not as a hell, but as a layered space. What I would think people almost relate to a multiverse in terms of the journey that people would take from this existence into the next one. And by the way, they believed in reincarnation, in which the cycle would begin again and people
Right.
would come back.
Okay.
And through that underworld, you see this, you see this dog who was both a guide and, if necessary, if need be, for this person to make it through the underworld and they were found worthy to make it through and to come back, the dog would even sacrifice itself to help that person complete the journey. So oftentimes with the Day of the Dead, you'll see figures of these dogs. This is why. It's not
Okay.
just, this is everything has a significance. It's not for decoration.
Okay.
Next. Yeah, next. Oftentimes when you see things, people have seen probably the movie Coco, they see things up in the stores. I mean, now it's like what's happening, you think about the commodity, you think about the monetization of culture. You go into Walmart, you can find stuff on Kwanzaa, you can find stuff on, this, all things that had deep roots and have been, frankly, now have been turned into moments of t-shirts and things that you buy in the stores, and the Day of the
Sure.
Dead is no different. But when you see these images of skulls and snakes and skeletons, this comes from deep in indigenous thinking. And so, like, for example, these skull imageries, what you see at the far left, this is from central Mexico from about 2,000 years ago. So this is from Teotihuacan, which is one of the oldest cities in the Americas. This city was old when the people we call the Aztecs, the Mexica, when they actually showed up in central Mexico, when they showed up,
Okay.
they found this city was already there.
All
And
right.
so this major area, this symbol, you can see these symbols being used. This is at 2,000 years ago, and they were being used even before then. So it was old even then.
Is that
And
his
you see it,
tongue?
it's what you see is out flailing out. But understand, with the symbol of the tongue, it's not only it can be symbolic of many things. It can be symbolic of speech. It can also be symbolic of sacrifice. Bloodletting was done through the tongue, for example, within certain indigenous peoples in this part of the Americas. They would pull, like, for example, with the case of the Mayan people, there's imagery of them pulling thorns through the tongue in order to bloodlet. Also, I want to let the gentlemen out there, don't be squeamish, gentlemen, but it was also, they would, for example, amongst the Mayan people, they would do bloodletting through male genitals too. So using thorns, places of the body, of the
Yeah.
body in terms of giving a gift. But so this image here of, quote, the death god, why you see these things, this goes deep into the ancestral memory of this part of the world. And also the other thing is that there was always among these peoples an acceptance that the dead not only hear you, but they talk to you, and that
Mhm.
there was lines of communication through the practice of their religions and spirituality for this. So what you see at the right is actually an example from the Mayan people. This is about 500 years later from what you see on the at your left, where you have Mayan royalty, a woman. And she's actually shown in the bottom right hand corner, where she is getting advice from an ancestor, a warrior, about them waging war. And so what you see here is her. She has done a blood sacrifice. You can't hardly see it, but at the bottom of this stone image, you'll see something that looks like a basket right at the bottom. And it looks like little paper sticking out. They were
Right.
paper,
Right.
in which she had offered her blood, put it on paper, burned it along with incense to conjure up and communicate with her ancestor. And who you see is the ancestor. So if you look very closely, what looks like a curving S
Right.
on that. It's actually a vision serpent. And when that serpent opens its mouth, who looks out is her ancestor. And you know he's a warrior because he has a spear. And you can see how they venerated ancestors, because even though the person who has summoned him is royalty,
Right.
she is lower than he is,
Okay, I
because
got
he is a revered ancestor. So this notion of serpents also becomes one as being part of this communication with the ancestors. This is why you see these kinds of images for the Day of the Dead. And here's an example. This is from the 20th century. Detroiters know, of course, we have the privilege of having in the Detroit Institute of Arts the Diego Rivera Court, that includes a mural called, dedicated to the industrialization and the story of industrial Detroit from the 1930s, that was done by one of the greatest muralists of the 20th century, Diego Rivera from
you. Right.
Mexico. In Mexico, he's known as in Spanish, one of the los tres grandes, the three greats. There were two others that were also considered his peers, but Diego Rivera would be invited by Edsel Ford, the son of Henry Ford, to transform the Detroit Institute of Arts, the core of it, and would place the mural that we see there.
Right.
But in addition, yeah. So this, who we see here, though, this is one of his. This is image you see is from a famous mural that is in Mexico City. And the reason why I'm showing it to you is, if you look right in the center,
Right.
this is a common image that you see on the Day of the Dead. A woman in this hat, she's a skeleton. Notice her feather boa is made like a serpent.
Right.
This is all coming from indigenous imagery. I mean, this is coming
Let
from
me
what you
let me stop
saw
you here. What
before.
is this to do?
Well, what you see here,
Yeah.
this is actually the painting here, this image. This is deep political social commentary on Mexico about 10 years before the Mexican Revolution. And what you see here is a battle of class. There's a battle of racial identities. There's a battle of social identity that's going on. The old and the new worlds are all playing themselves out in this one image, which, by the way, is part of a much bigger mural.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
what you see, yeah, and actually, Diego Rivera himself is in the mural. If you look to the left of the skeletal woman, you see looks like a small child.
Right.
That's actually Diego Rivera, because at the time that this painting takes place, he was actually a teenager, late teens. Standing behind him, is the woman that would become his wife, Frida Kahlo. Now world recognized as one of the most famous women painters of the 20th century. But what you see here is that Diego Rivera is showing Europeanized Mexico, colonized Mexico, but indigenous Mexico is right here in the center. And that's what he always would gravitate toward. Also, Diego Rivera had commentary also on African Mexico as well, which has a significant influence, particularly in southern Mexico. But this image that you see here in the middle is actually a very political one, because what it is, it shows indigenous imagery of the skulls, of the serpent figure. But notice how she's dressed. You know, she's in European clothing, very
Right.
nice European clothing.
Right.
Mexico at the beginning part of the 20th century had tremendous poverty. There was very little, there was very little middle class, so to speak. And what you saw, of course, disproportionately, who were the most disenfranchised, were indigenous Mexicans. And
Okay, let me
so,
stop you there. Let me stop you. So is what
yeah,
are they saying in this? The
what the,
Europeans are on top, and the black and the yeah, you go ahead and tell us what they're saying, and let's go to the next.
listen, let's be clear that race and colorism plays a role in power. And Mexico was not exempt from that, even though Mexico, by the way, as a note, had the first president of African descent in the Americas, because, in this part of the Americas, because Vicente Guerrero, who became president in Mexico shortly after its independence, who was a general, was
Right.
of African and
Yeah,
indigenous descent.
I heard that.
Um, yeah, exactly. And then you had Benito Juarez in the 19th century, who was indigenous, who becomes president of Mexico. but becoming president doesn't mean you have all power. And power rests in Mexico, goes along lines of color and
Right.
ethnicity along. So, but what you see here is a social commentary saying, who is Mexico and what is it going to be? And the figure in the center was actually a pointing of the figure. That symbol represented literally people. It was kind of like Marie Antoinette. I've made it and let the rest of them eat cake. And so
Oh,
that's why you see the fineness of the clothes, the hat,
okay.
and the
Okay.
and the person who created that imagery is actually standing next to the skeleton.
I got
And
you.
he was a very famous political commentator of his day, and Diego Rivera was honoring him. He's the guy in the derby and the bowler. And also, if you'll notice, you see to the far right an indigenous woman, and it's
Yes.
clear she's indigenous, but notice she's in Western clothes,
Yeah.
and she's kind of really looking real salty at the guy
Right.
in the bowler, because they're
Yes.
trading daggers, because they're looking at, what does it mean to be Mexican? What does it mean to be indigenous?
Yeah.
And then you see the same things. This is, cuts across indigenous belief. You see it with the Mayan people, with their version of the tree of life, in which, and the symbol of it, one, a spiritual symbol, by the way, it's also spiritual in Africa as well, the ceiba tree. The ceiba tree is found in West Africa. It's also found throughout the Caribbean and South America. And so people, think about the Day of the Dead. They think about Coco, cartoons that they have seen, the music, and that's all part of it. Because the Day of the Dead is not a time to mourn. It is a
Okay.
time to celebrate. And traditionally, what it was done is it was done not on the inside. In Mexico and in Guatemala, this was always celebrated in public spaces because it was about community. These were community celebrations. So you may have been honoring ancestors that you have recently lost or may have been for a while, but you did so in community, and you did so in places where the dead were. And you also, there were symbols that were used. Marigolds were often used because that the smell of the marigolds was considered to be one that was pleasing and enticing
That's a
to the
plant,
dead.
right?
That is correct. The marigold flower. If you're a
Okay.
gardener,
Right.
you probably have one in your
I got you. I
backyard.
got you. I got you.
Um, Incense was used again to carry the message. Remember that image from that woman from Mayan royalty
Right.
more
Right.
than 1,000 years ago? Now they're burning incense to the ancestors, beckoning them to come and celebrate with them.
Right.
Food
I
was
got you.
always be offered, alcoholic beverages, and also music.
I
Music
got
was
you.
critical. And so these celebrations were always, very much so. So the dead are always seen to be right within reach. But what happens is that at a certain point in the year, that veil becomes thin. And that's why often you will see in Day of the Dead celebrations, there will be an archway. What you're doing is opening up the door to that arch.
Okay. Let me do this for the sake of the timing, because we we talk so much about the other and this. Let me get to this point. What did you celebrate the Day of Dead growing up?
The short answer is no, because my ancestry is not from Mexico or Guatemala. Now, and what you see is that the celebration of the Day of the Dead through the establishment of altars or ofrendas really comes out of Los Angeles. And it comes out during the time of the Chicano Power Movement. It begins about 10 years into the movement. The movement starts in the 60s, and you begin to see public celebration of the Day of the Dead take place again in Los Angeles, beginning in the late 70s, where there is a consciousness about the reclaiming of indigeneity as being as being so, front and center in amongst the Chicano community. And what happened, and the reason why it was something that had been, in many ways, had gone only inward within people's homes, because remember, these celebrations were done traditionally in cemeteries, in public spaces. That didn't work in Los Angeles of the 20th century, where, even though it was founded by Mexicans in the late 1700s, 20th century, or for that matter, once the United States took control of California, These spaces in California became American dominated. Los Angeles became one that was dominated by white Angelenos, and it was a city in which Mexicans had very, if any, until the later on in the 20th century, any political power. And so
Okay.
there's a celebration. You did not go to a cemetery in Los Angeles to start singing and pouring tequila and placing flowers and burning incense to the dead. That changes with the Chicano power movement and civil rights, where people are saying, I'm going to be my total self.
Okay.
So what starts there with as a deeply Mexican tradition, it grows in Los Angeles to be one of community building and healing. So it spreads. And so when you see ofrendas at the Day of the Dead in Los Angeles, it might be from a Korean family. And you might have on the same altar the Katrina figure next to images from Korea. It could be someone who is from Honduras. It could be someone who's from Ireland. It could be someone who identifies as African American. What has happened is ofrenda has turned into a way to build bridges on something that is universal. We are all born, we all die.
Okay.
And how do we process that within our communities? And that these are not also, it's not just about individual deaths. It can be about group deaths. So for example, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, there were a number across the country of ofrendas done publicly to honor George Floyd. There was one done here in Detroit at St. Anne's Basilica in Southwest Detroit that honored George Floyd and Breonna Taylor,
Oh,
both of
really?
them.
Okay. Good.
Absolutely. And at the Detroit Institute of Arts here in our city, which is one of the great museums of the United States, they've been honoring this tradition for about 10 years. And the ofrendas represent, while they all have common elements, traditional elements, those marigolds, an archway, perhaps, skeletal figures, maybe that Zolo. There's very modern, diverse expressions. I remember about 5 years ago seeing an ofrenda done at the DIA to honor Joe Louis.
Okay. Let me stop you
And
there in this regard. So now you mentioned the DIA. There's an exhibit that you are doing there. Tell us about
well,
the
not
exhibit and so on and so forth.
yeah. This year, last year, as part of the Center for Latino Studies, we did have an installation in the ofrenda. We are not this year. We'll be doing tours for students and faculty. But this was the one that we did last year. And just to kind of show people like the basic elements of it, ofrendas are a story. They always have a theme. Everything that you see is symbolic. It's not just decorative. By the way, and I'm so sorry I didn't do this. The word ofrenda means gift or offering. It is different than a religious altar, where you actually go and bow down and are praying to a divine being. It is in the form of an altar, but it is a gift. And the gift is between the living and the dead. It
I got you.
includes religious imagery, usually, but not always,
I got
especially in modern ofrendas. People
you. I
may
got
not have a religious tradition, but they wish to find a way to honor their ancestors. And ofrenda has become a way of honoring anything from a beloved relative to um, those whose lives have been taken, for example, in the case of like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. In Mexico, there were many ofrendas done in recent years to a group of 43 students from southern Mexico who were kidnapped and presumed executed in Mexico for their by a combination of the government and a drug cartel. And so social and political commentary also is a part of ofrendas. And it was in this one, the imagery that you see in the middle is actually a quote from a Honduran environmental activist who was murdered in 2016. And she had a quote that basically translates into English saying, you may have the bullets and the guns, but we, the people, have the word.
you. Okay.
When you fire a gun, the bullet is spent. But when you say a word, it lives on.
Okay. Let me stop
And
you there in this regard. Let me stop you there for the sake of time. So now could anybody do one of these using those imageries? Do they have to be of Mexican descent or to be official, or
Well, let me stop you there. When we talk about, I think when we talk about being official, I think what I think is important to the viewers is to understand is that there's a difference between finding in your humanity in someone else's and seeing a space where you can express yourself in your way and also honor their traditions at the same time.
so let me ask you this these questions. Are you a historian? What are you?
Um, let's see. And I take a deep pause with that because I consider myself a storyteller and that I am continuing a tradition that was instilled in me in my home. And that the stories that called me are the stories of the Americas. And it is for me in an educational context for my students to see themselves at the center of the American story, that not as a footnote, not as an aside, and
Okay.
that and that their role in what we call America is indeed very American, very, because it is about it is about the practice of the possibilities and the promise of America, and that they have been a part of that story since before there was a United States.
Okay.
As you know, so that is but I think the term for me that I'm most comfortable with is storyteller. And
Okay.
I attempt to do that being rooted in history, rooted in the present, but also thinking forward to what may be the possibilities to come.
Have you written a book?
I have not. I was honored to produce a spoken word show at the Charles Wright Museum shortly
Okay.
before the pandemic on Latinx identities here in Detroit. I've lectured in a number of spaces. I'm on faculty now. Been on faculty now. This is year 8 for me at Wayne State University, and I also produced a documentary short discussing the history of Detroit in the 1980s and its relationship to the sanctuary movement in response to the civil wars that were raging in the 1980s in El Salvador and Guatemala, and how Detroit had a second underground railroad. The first one was that of the 19th century, of course, where Detroit is known as Midnight, as the last stop on the Underground Railroad to freedom by those, by folk who were fleeing, those human beings fleeing fleeing the scourge of slavery in this country.
Right.
And in the 20th century, you have Central Americans who were fleeing the horror of civil war, seeking refuge in the United States, but also at that time in Canada as well.
Right. I got you. Well, hey, I thank you so much. I did, my best to try to help people understand this, and I think we got there.
I hope so.
Yeah,
And and
you. Let me ask you this. This is one more question. You're proud of yourself for keeping this alive, aren't you?
yeah. Yes, because my thing is that when I say I'm a storyteller, we have to, and I think this is what maybe if I can leave folks with anything, it is this, is that we all are storytellers. So my thing is that for me, I look at this as the privilege of furthering the stories of those who may otherwise would not have been heard.
I got you. Everybody,
Yeah.
this is what we do here at Strong Inspirations. We find these people, experts, storytellers. How about that? Expert
Hey, and I want to
storytellers, and allow them to
hey,
go and tell it. And she only touched upon it. I'm going to definitely ask her to come back because I know there's much more. We try to keep it to a certain time frame, but I know she know much more than this on different angles, and she's got an open door policy to come back on Strong Inspirations. We're
well,
going to
thank
make
you
it
so
one of the
much.
live discussions too.
Well,
You'll
thank you
see
so much, Anthony. Thank you so much. It was a privilege being here.
that. I thank you so very much for coming on. Everybody hit the subscribe button. Like I say, it's free. You get some very in-depth information from all angles here at Strong Inspirations. Hit the like button. There is no love button. Hit the notifications bell so that you get notified when new content is on the show. Join us every Monday from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Zoom link is on the website businessintheblack.net, and it is also noted on Eventbrite. And to you, my sister, I say this and I mean this with all sincerity. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. You listened to your grandmother and grandparents, and it made an impact on your life to where you chose it as a career choice.
Yes.
And now, a few years later, we ain't home to how many. That's not the point. But nonetheless, a few years later, you are keeping the mantle and the torch and the candle and the light lit on your culture and the culture of people from the Puerto Rican nation and those here in America and around the world. It's a beautiful thing. I thank you for doing this. It is one thing I do have asked you. Can you say something in your native language?
Well, first of all,
Goodbye
just to
type
be
thing?
well, first of all, let me just be clear. Like many folks of Latino origins, I actually spoke English before I spoke Spanish. But what I would like to say, since I've given all of what I've given all of this in English, I will I will I will close out. And I will close out in Spanish, and I will say de que me gustaría dar a todo el mundo que está escuchando bendiciones y gracias por todo el tiempo que ustedes han pasado con nosotros hoy. Y que ustedes recuerden que sus historias, sus memorias valen. Diga sus historias. El mundo, todo el mundo necesita oírlos. Gracias.
Thank you so very much. Bye-bye. We out.
Take care. Take care,
Take care.
Anthony. Bye-bye.